In this video, I want to talk about how you can think of layers when writing your game in Korge. So in a previous video, I talked about how you can have these containers, and the way that these containers was implemented was that they had this array of children, and it followed this painter's algorithm where each child is written on top of the other if there are any overlapping children. So for example, if we had this solid rectangle and the circle was on top of this rectangle, then the circle would be drawn on top of it because it's secondary in the children array. Same goes with like any additional children that gets written as it iterates through this array. So an addendum of this kind of approach here is that you can create containers that represent each of your different layers. So for example, we can have this root container here, and for the root container we can create a bunch of layers. One layer, or which is represented by a container, could represent the background. The other could be like the foliage. For example, if you're like creating an RPG or something, it could be the trees or the grass and plants that are written on top of the background layer. Next, we can have a character layer, which draws your actual sprites and enemies, monsters, etc., etc. And then lastly, we can maybe have this UI layer, which is the UI, since it's always on top of everything else. So yeah, this is like a way that you can, a pattern in which you can write your Korge games using this layered approach. So how would you go about implementing it? Well, the way that you can do it is just start by creating layers for each thing that you want to represent. So we could have a background layer, which is just a container. So just create a bunch of these empty containers for each of these backgrounds. For each of these layers. So we can have one for foliage, container, and then a character layer, UI layer. So something like this. And then anytime you are thinking about adding a view, think about which layer you want to add it to, and then just add that view into that specific layer. So for example, the background layer might have a solid rectangle that we want to add. So let's make this very big, just to make it very clear what is what. So for the colors, let's do colors.brown. This will be our background. Next, we can have the foliage, which could be something that is smaller than that. So let's do 700 by 700. This can be green. Next, we can have a character layer, which is 50 by 50, and this could be red. Then finally, our UI layer could be I guess in this case we can put it anywhere. Let's do .apply. Let's change our XY to be 500 by 500. Let's do 200 by 200. And for this, let's make this whatever this color is. Right, so if we run it, then, okay, what is happening here? Oh, right. Okay, so the width and height is way too big. So we need, let's just increase this. 1500 by 1500. There we go. All right. So at the bottommost layer, we have the background layer. And then here we have the foliage layer, and then here we have the character itself. And actually I want to show the UI layer being a bit overlapping with the background layer just to show that it's above it. So let's do 800 by 800 here. All right, so yeah. Cool. So yeah, just take note. You can think about containers in this kind of way, and maybe it might be intuitive for you to think about it this way. There's also another approach that I'll get into in another video for how you can decide on the indexes for when a layer or for when a view is drawn. I'll talk about that in a separate video. All right, so let's go through our very large example here. So for my own game, if I look at this UIMap here and I go ahead and run it, so I have something called a UIMap, which is this whole entire grid thing right here. And you see that we have this like background layer, which is a gridded pattern. Then we have these rocks and then these entities here. So the way that I implemented myself was that I created this UIMap container component. So first we initialize a bunch of various sizes that we need to render stuff. And then you see here that when it initializes, the way that Kotlin initializes stuff is that it goes from top to bottom. So first we create the board layer, then we have a layer for the grid numbers, then another one for the grid lines, and then inside of this grid lines layer I created the graphics itself. Then there's the speed area layer, which is another thing that the maps can have, which are these like auras, which I represented by circles, but I didn't show that in my example. We have the entity layer, which can be like the different entities, the rocks, teleports, stuff like that. Entity label, so the labels for each of the entities. So if I go ahead and run it, you can see that we have these labels here. So that's always written on top of the entity layer. Then we have the pathing lines, and inside we have the pathing line graphics, which represents these lines here, because they should always be written on top of everything else. Then there's this highlight layer, which is when if I add a tower, then you see that there's this highlight thing. So I have it as its own little layer, so that's always on top of everything else. And yeah, I have the rectangle that's already created, but I just keep it invisible until I actually need it. So yeah, this is a way that you can represent your UI components. I found this to be pretty intuitive for at least the stuff that I've been doing. I know there are a few cases where you might not want this layered approach, so I'll talk about another method in which you can represent or keep your elements sorted by some specific custom value so that it's always rendered in a way that you want. But I'll talk about that in a separate video. So yeah, that is basically it. Hopefully this helps. Thanks for watching.